Hey everybody, it's Matt. Welcome back to the Journey Church podcast. If you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you can automatically get our weekly episodes. And you might want to go ahead and subscribe to our Journey YouTube channel as well. You'll find messages, music, interviews, inspiring stories, and more for you all right there. Now, I hope this episode helps you take your next step in following Jesus. Today I want to start by asking you a question that none of you are going to think is really relevant to you, which is probably not the best way to start, but I'm going to try to convince you it is relevant to you. You're not going to think it's relevant to you because, most of you anyway, because of your age. But this is something I want you to answer, even though you may want to brush it aside, okay? The question is simply this: who would you like to be like? Who would you like to be like? See, you don't think it's a question for you because most of us, we think about this when we're younger, right? When we're kids, and then we grow up and we're like, well, I don't need to think about this anymore. But I want you to think about it. And the reason I want you to think about it is when you start thinking about the people that you actually would like to be like, or the people you respect and admire, my guess is you move past all the glitz and all the glamour pretty quick. You move past all the fame and the fortune pretty quick. And you are at a point now where you realize the people you respect and admire the most, they are the people who have character, and they're the people who over a period of time have demonstrated the kind of integrity that has earned your respect. And this is what's so interesting about this. None of those people necessarily have special abilities or special powers. You respect them because of the choices they have made, the choices you have watched them make over a period of time that have demonstrated the kind of character and integrity that you go, oh my gosh, that's what I hope I'm known for too. So I want to flip this question for just a second, and I want you to think about this. What would it feel like if someone was asked this question and you came to mind for them? Imagine how incredible that would be if somebody came up to you and they said, hey, I was asked who I want to be like, and you made my list because of that. Well, that might happen. It might happen for some of you right now. For others of you, it might happen in the future, but it's only going to happen based on the choices you make. And that's the irony of it all. It is our choices every day, some of them that we know are big deals and some of them that don't really feel like a big deal, but it's those choices every day that actually lead to us becoming the kind of person that one day somebody will want to be like. And what I want to do today is I want to talk through how you can set yourself up to succeed in making the kind of choices that you become the kind of person that you would respect the most if you were somebody else. We're in part 4 of this series we've been in called The Perfect Guide for Life. We've been talking about how integrity brings clarity and how it brings courage. And as we've said, we all celebrate integrity when we see it in other people. We all criticize it when we see it lacking in someone or we see somebody have a breach of integrity. Oddly enough, we expect it out of everybody that's around us. It doesn't matter what they believe or where they grew up, their religious, affiliation. We just think everybody ought to have integrity. We expect it out of everybody. And yet at the same time, if you're anything like me, you tend to excuse it when you lack it. Because when I lack integrity, when I breach integrity, well, there's a whole story behind it, right? And I want to give the whole context. And you don't understand in this situation, and it was different because. And so we all have a tendency to do that. And because we're so apt to excuse away our lack of integrity, we've set a really high bar, a really high definition for what integrity is, as we've talked about it through the series. Our definition is simply, integrity is doing what you ought to, even when it costs you. Integrity is having the resolve and the courage to do the right thing, even though doing the right thing is going to have consequences associated with it. That's what integrity is. And all of us want that to be true about us. All of us want to have the resolve and the courage to do the right thing, even though we know there may be consequences, even though we know it's going to cost us something. We want to have the resolve and courage to do the right thing, even though we know sometimes, or we feel sometimes it might cost us everything. And yet, come on, at the same time, you know this. While we all value it, it's really hard to live out. While we all aspire to it, it's really hard to actually do. And the reason's because of what we talked about last week. Integrity is not the only thing vying for our attention. On one hand, we've got integrity over here pulling for our attention, but on the other hand, we have our appetites or our desires, our wants, our emotions, all of the things that are immediate, that are right now, that are pulling for our attention too. And if we're not careful, we live every day in this tension between the two, being pulled in two directions, having two voices. And the immediate, the immediate, the right now, well, that has a way of drowning out everything else, doesn't it? The appetites have a way of pulling us, if we're not careful, to where we choose them more times than we don't. And yet, depending on which choice you make, well, you know this, it leads to two very different destinations. And so as King Solomon wrote, and we've been looking at this statement, this principle that he wrote years and years and years ago, and I've been encouraging you to try to memorize it. If you've been with us, I hope you got it memorized. If not, take a little time to memorize it. I told you, my fifth graders got memorized, and you're smarter than a fifth grader. All of you are, okay? So I know you can do this. Solomon simply wrote this. He said, the integrity of the upright will guide them. In other words, integrity of people who say, you know what, I'm going to think down the road. I'm not going to listen to just what I want right now, to my appetites, to my emotions. I'm going to think about where I want to be in the long run, where my choices are taking me, where my decisions are leading me. The integrity of people like that, well, it'll always guide them. It'll be the perfect guide for life. And those people understand I need to make that kind of integrity my North Star. I need to make it the primary decision-making filter for my life. So that's where integrity leads, but where's your appetites lead? Well, on the other hand, Solomon says the crookedness, or the crookedness is like, that's people who are bent over. They're people who are just thinking about the right here and right now. They're just looking right in front of them. They're listening to their appetites. He says the crookedness of the treacherous. Treacherous are people who deceive. They don't just deceive others, they deceive themselves, which is what we all do when we start listening to our appetites, right? We convince ourselves that what I'm about to do that I would tell other people is not the right thing to do, it's the right thing for me, and here's why. We build this case in our head and deceive ourselves. The crookedness of the treacherous, Solomon says, will destroy them. And I don't have to convince you of this because you already know it from life experience. It doesn't just destroy you, it damages and sometimes destroys the people around you. Because your lack of integrity is never isolated, isn't it? This is the ironic thing about integrity. It is personal, but it is never private. And so whenever you find yourself or you hear somebody saying, well, it's my choice. I mean, it's personal. I can do what I want with my life, you know? You can't tell me what's right or wrong. I can do what I want. Okay, yeah, it's personal, but it's not private. And you already know this. It's not private. Your breach of integrity doesn't stay in your heart. The consequences don't stay confined to your life. The load from your breach of integrity, the stress from that, the consequences of that, they get transferred to the people around you. And your irresponsibility ends up becoming their responsibility. This is how it works. You have life stories. Again, I don't have to convince you of this. You have life stories where somebody else's, your dad's, your mom's, a coach's, a teacher's, a boss, whoever, their irresponsibility created so much damage that it impacted your life and became your responsibility. You had to pick up the slack. You had to put pieces back together. You had to navigate through things you should have never had to navigate through. You had to be responsible for things you should have never been responsible for because of their irresponsibility. It's always the way it works. Our irresponsibility always eventually ends up being their responsibility. There is a price tag to pay for a lack of integrity. There's always a price to pay when you give your integrity away. So, what I want to do today is I want to talk a little bit more about this tension that we all live in between our appetites and our integrity. We all want this, but man, this screams at us. This feels good in the moment. And when you're living in the middle of this, how do you consistently make the right choices to choose this, even though there's a long-term benefit and sometimes short-term pain, instead of this when it's what you want right now? And in order to think about those choices in a way that you eventually can make a series of choices and become the kind of person that somebody else admires and respects, we're going to take a lesson from history. I want to take you all the way back to 605 BC, 2,600 years ago. You probably have heard of Nebuchadnezzar. He's talked about in all kinds of school history classes. So Nebuchadnezzar, to give you a little context, in this year, he made a transition. At first, he was commander-in-chief of the Babylonian army. And the Babylonian Empire at the moment during this year, it was the pinnacle of their power. They were the most powerful empire in the entire world, economically, militarily, you name it. The Babylonians were at the top of the food chain. Nebuchadnezzar starts the year as commander-in-chief, eventually transitions into actually becoming king. And some of you who history buffs might remember this. In 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar took the Babylonian army. He marched all the way down to Egypt engaged in what was known as the Battle of Carchemish. And basically Nebuchadnezzar was like, all right, I'm going to take the most powerful armies in the world at the time, and I'm going to defeat them so that we can have supremacy as Babylonians. So in the Battle of Carchemish, he battled the Egyptians and the Assyrians who had joined forces, and some Medes and Persians. Basically, all of those other nations that at one point had so much power, they all came together and said, let's try together to stop Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians before this Babylonian wave just takes over the world. So they all get together at Carchemish and they battle. The Babylonians win. And Nebuchadnezzar's feeling himself. He's flexing. He's feeling so good about what he's done. He's like, all right, you know what I think we're going to do? On the way back to Babylon, let's just stop and defeat every other nation along the way. I mean, he was just looking for a fight. And unfortunately for the Jewish people, the southern kingdom of Judah was right there near, not too far away from where the Battle of Carchemish happened. And so Nebuchadnezzar's like, let's just march right over there, go up to Jerusalem. We're going to hit them first and wipe them out, and I'll make them part of the Babylonian Empire too. And so he does. He marches over to Jerusalem. He conquers Jerusalem really quickly. He takes the king who's over Judah at the time, and he has him sent back to Babylon because it's kind of an odd deal. But Nebuchadnezzar collected kings, like literally collected kings. As some of you have collections of things, he collected kings. He'd get them all, every nation he conquered, he'd take the king, instead of killing them, he would kill all their sons so they didn't have any heirs to the throne. And then the last thing they would see is their sons being murdered, and then he would blind them, send them back to Babylon, and he would hold them there. And then whenever Nebuchadnezzar had parties and he wanted to entertain people, he would send the word, and they would take all of the kings and they would bind them with gold chains, and they'd be in a line, right? Like a long conga line, think of it that way. And he would say, parade them through the party. And so they would just get all these blind kings paraded through the party, and then he could point out, oh yeah, I defeated them and them and them. It was like his own personal trophy case. It's kind of morbid, but that's the way he did it. So anyway, he takes the king of Judah, says, all right, you're deposed. I'm sending you back. You're going to be part of my collection. He puts a puppet king in place in Jerusalem who basically is like, hey, I'm going to tell you you're king. You get to call yourself king, but you're really just a slave of mine. And so as long as you send me this much money, this much tribute every year, everything's good. The minute you don't do that, I'm coming, I'm overthrowing you, I'll kill you and put somebody else in your place. So he does that, he gets that all set up. And then he marches over to the temple in Jerusalem, which obviously is a sacred place for the Jews. And Nebuchadnezzar marches right through the temple and gathers up a bunch of sacred souvenirs, all the things that are so valuable and meaningful to the Jewish people, loads them up, says, I'm taking them back to Babylon, I'm going to put those in my trophy case too. And then right before he leaves town, this happens. He looks at his primary official. King ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. And he gives a description of exactly who he's looking for. He says, Ashpenaz, I want you to find young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude in every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand. Gentlemen, you were so fortunate you weren't living back then, because you'd all ended up in, you check all the boxes, don't you? Maybe not. Anyway, turn to the lady no, don't do that. That's going to create problems. I'm sure you check some of the boxes. These guys, it's pretty high bar, but he's like, Ashpenaz, I want you to find the best of the best among the Israelite young men. And he has a reason for this. He goes on, he says, I want you to find the ones that are qualified to serve in the king's palace. This was brilliant on Nebuchadnezzar's part. He actually did it with every nation he conquered. So he would take the best and the brightest of their young men back to Babylon. We're going to see this in a minute. Put them in a training program so they could serve in his government. And this did a couple of things. Number one, it made his government stronger. He's getting the brightest people from around the known world to all serve there. So that was great. It also diminished the ability or the odds that there would be a rebellion against him, because he had all of the sons of the nobility of these nations. So it was kind of like as he was leaving town, he'd look at them and say, hey, moms, y'all make sure nobody rebels or I'm going to kill your son. I got him up there at Babylon now, okay? And so it just kind of took care of everything. They're like, well, we can't do anything. He's got our sons up there. So it was an interesting way for Nebuchadnezzar to gain control and influence over a vast empire. And so that's what he does. He takes all of these young men, all right, from Jerusalem. He says, Ashpenaz, I want you to carry them back. We're going to take a long trek. And when they get there, here's the program that they're going to be entered into. The writer tells us that he was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. So this is full immersion, if you will. He's taking Jewish people or young men, or in some cases Egyptian, Assyrian, you name it, Persian. And he's like, you're going to get back here, and it's complete indoctrination, complete assimilation into Babylonian culture. I'm going to you can read and see he gives them all new names because he's like, I own you now, so I get to name you. Your mama doesn't get to name you anymore. So he gives them new names. He teaches them all about Babylonian literature and culture and teaches them a new language because he doesn't want them to think of themselves ever again as Jewish or Assyrian or Egyptian. He wants them to think of themselves as Babylonians. So this is a big part of the training program. But there were some perks that came with it. The writer goes on to tell us that the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table, which to us, we're like, oh, okay, so you're feeding them. But to them, in a world where food insecurity was a normal thing, where so many people didn't know the next day where their food was going to come from, this is a big deal. I mean, it's the best of a bad situation, if you will. You've been kidnapped. You're a prisoner of war. You're in essence a slave, going to have to live and serve in a foreign country under a foreign king. But at least you're not killed, and you're not in a salt mine, and you're not working construction in a hazardous situation. You're going to be in the government. You're going to have a really good job, and you're getting to eat from the king's table. You got a meal plan, you know. It's like this is a pretty good deal considering the circumstances they're under. And then the writer tells us that they were to be trained for 3 years. So this program takes 3 years. And after that, they were to enter the king's service. So there's an overview of what lies ahead for these Jewish young men who are taken out of Jerusalem. Now, you actually, it doesn't matter if you're a church person or not, you probably, if you grew up in West Kentucky, you probably know the names of 4 of these young men. And the only reason you know the names is because your mama sent you to Vacation Bible School as a kid, if you were around here, all right? And I call these the Fab Four of VBS lore because you couldn't go to a VBS without hearing these stories, all right? So you recognize these. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These were 4 of the young men who were taken. Now again, you may have heard their names, but here's what I don't want you to miss. All 4 of these guys are around 15 years old when this happens. Now just stop, and I know you may be familiar with them. I want you to stop and think about this. How unlikely is it that you would know the names of 4 15-year-olds who lived 2,600 years ago? Why in the world would we ever know their story? Well, we wouldn't unless something happened. And this is where the twist of the story comes in. And I'll just give you a little heads up. The twist of the story is that these 4 young men, in the middle of incredible fear and uncertainty, think about this, they're marching from their homeland, from their family, never to see them again, to a place they've never been, on this long trek to Babylon. These 4 young men find themselves caught in the tension between their integrity and their desires, their appetites, what they want and what life is screaming at them they better do right now. And it is their choices that they made in the middle of this tension. They're the only reason we know their story 2,600 years later. We don't know the names or the stories of any of the other young men, but we know these 4. And here's why. Because as they were marching, and as they heard what awaited them in Babylon, and as they heard about all the details of this training program, the writer tells us, but Daniel resolved. As he's a prisoner of war, as he's a slave, Daniel resolved. He set his heart. He made up his mind not to defile himself, not to desecrate, to stain, to pollute, to lower himself with the king's food and wine. To which, as I read this, my first thought was, out of all the things you're going to have an issue with, Daniel, this is the one you're going to draw a line at? Like, we could talk about the whole king collection and everything he's doing. We could talk about all Nebuchadnezzar's, cruelty and brutality. Like, you're drawing a line over the meal plan, over the menu that he's going to serve you. But let me give you a little context and it'll make a bit more sense. So in Jewish culture, when they thought about God's involvement in their life, here's how they thought about it. They believed that God is the one who provided them food. You think Kroger or Walmart provides you food, but that's not the way it worked back then, okay? So they immediately thought if we have food, it's because God gave it to us. God gives us food, which nourishes our body, which helps us to be healthy so that we can then have prosperity. This is how they viewed the world. If you were to ask them, how is God involved in your life? They would say, well, every good thing in our lives is from God. It's all from him because he gave us the food. A lot of people don't have food. We've got food every day. He gave us food to nourish our body, to keep us healthy, so we could succeed, so we could work, so we could prosper, so we could do all the things that we're doing. Which meant every time they sat down for a meal, they believed eating that meal was actually an act of worship. It was an expression for them of thank you, God, for providing this, which then provides everything else good in my life. Now, the Babylonians had a similar belief, only they did not believe all the good things in their life came from Yahweh, the Jewish God. They believed everything came from Marduk, the Babylonian god, which was a real issue for Daniel. Because Daniel realized, wait a minute, if I sit down and I eat this food, then I am going to be expressing my gratitude and my thanks and my worship to a God I don't even believe in. And I'm going to be rebelling against and denying the God that I follow. To which we go, well, what's the big deal? Like, the Babylonians think of it that way, but you don't have to think of it that way, Daniel. I mean, what's the big deal? Like, you know in your heart who you're worshiping, so you don't have to go there. You know in your heart what's coming next. You know in your heart what's happening. You know you're not worshiping Marduk. Let them think what they want to think. Besides, you have no options, you know. You're now a slave. They're telling you what to do. But Daniel, according to the writer, Daniel made up his mind. I'm not crossing that line. But here's what I don't want you to miss. He made up his mind ahead of time. He didn't wait until he was in Babylon, seated at the table, to decide whether he was going to eat the food or not. When he heard about it, he realized, this is going too far. I cannot rebel against my God in this way. I'm just not going to violate my integrity and do that. So on the trek, where he didn't know how anything was going to turn out, where he was uncertain of all the outcomes, where there must have been extraordinary fear, Daniel just made up his mind in that moment, before I ever get in that situation, I'm just not eating it. I'm just not eating it. Now, before we go on, if you're wondering, why in the world would Daniel act like everything was riding on something that seems to us like nothing? It's a great question. I mean, again, it's a little thing. Just eat the food and, say a silent prayer to God and thank him and move on. But here's what Daniel knew. Here's what some of you probably know. One breach of integrity leads to another. The first breach makes the second breach easier. And the second breach creates a pattern. I don't know how at 15 years old Daniel figured this out. That's a lot of wisdom. But I think Daniel knew in that moment where emotions and fear were running so rampant, I think Daniel knew, if I have a breach of integrity here, if I violate it once, if I condone this, if I excuse away my lack of integrity one time, it's going to be a snowball. I'm just going to keep excusing away my integrity until I'm no different than any of these Babylonians. And he wasn't willing to go down that road and create a pattern. Now, we don't have much time to talk about this, and I don't really need to, because you already know this is true. Because you're like me. You've experienced this. You've had a breach of integrity where you've talked yourself into thinking something was okay that you've always said wasn't okay. And then the second time you had the opportunity, you did it again because you thought, well, I've already done it, so I can't make it worse. And the next thing you know, you had a pattern. You had an addiction. You had a problem because it just kept getting easier and easier to do it. Daniel said, I'm not going down that road. I will not defile myself. I am not going to breach my integrity the first time and open the door to a pattern developing. But you want to talk about integrity. Daniel also decided, I'm not going to deceive anybody, including my conquering masters. And so he does the unthinkable. Daniel resolves in his heart and in his mind, I'm not going to defile myself with this food. And then, the writer tells us, he asked Ashpenaz, the chief official, for permission not to defile himself this way. Now, you can imagine what Daniel's friends were saying. If we'd been there, we'd have been saying the same thing. It's like, okay, good grief, Daniel. If you want to draw a hard line at this and not eat the food, fine. But don't tell them you're not going to do it. Just feed it to the dog, slip it under the table. Figure out some way but don't go tell them, because Nebuchadnezzar is not known for his mercy. This isn't going to end well. You don't need to go broadcast what you're doing. But I think Daniel would have looked at us and said, well, I'm going to tell them, because to deceive is a lack of integrity. And I'm okay telling them because I'm not placing myself in the hands of Nebuchadnezzar's mercy. I am placing myself in the hands of God's mercy. I'm not counting on Nebuchadnezzar to have mercy towards me. And he may not. And God may not have mercy towards me in the sense of God may not honor me upholding my integrity, and I may die. Or he may uphold me or honor me upholding my integrity and come through in some way that I can't imagine. But either way, according to Daniel, he's like, at least I'll have my integrity no matter what happens. Now, this is key because Daniel was not trying to control the outcome. He had no idea what the outcome would be, but he wasn't trying to control it. He wasn't trying to take the path that would give him the best chance for things to turn out well for him. And the reason I mention that is because whenever you violate your integrity, whenever I do, it's because we're trying to control outcomes. That's the only reason we do it. I think if I do it my way, I've got a better chance of things turning out the way I want. So I will violate my integrity in this situation in order to get that outcome. Daniel didn't fall for that trap. See, when you sacrifice your integrity, you close the door to the possibility of God's activity. Let me say that again. When you sacrifice your integrity, you close the door to the possibility of God's activity that he might show up on your behalf and honor your integrity. Because when you sacrifice your integrity, you're taking control of the outcomes. You're taking responsibility. You're saying, God, I don't want you to be in control of it. I'm going to be responsible for it. And he says, okay. But as long as you choose to sacrifice your integrity because you think it'll get you the outcome you want, you will never know if God was going to show up and do something. You will never know if God was actually working behind the scenes the whole time. You'll never have one of those stories to tell of. You're not going to believe what God did. Daniel had no idea. But he wasn't going to try to control the outcome of this situation. And yet, in this case, God was at work, even though he didn't know it. The writer says, now God had caused Ashpenaz to show favor and compassion to Daniel. How could Daniel possibly imagine that God was at work here? God hadn't been at work to protect them in Jerusalem when they got conquered. Now he's marching to a foreign country as a slave. I mean, there's no evidence God's anywhere at work. Everything looks like God's abandoned them, and yet Daniel knew, I'm going to uphold my integrity no matter what. Well, he didn't know God was actually there at work the whole time, making Ashpenaz favorable towards Daniel and his friends. At the same time, Ashpenaz is like, I don't know how to deal with this. Nobody's ever asked for this, and this is not going to turn out for me. He voices his objection to Daniel. He says the official told him, I'm afraid of my lord the king, Nebuchadnezzar, who's assigned your food and drink. Why, he says, why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would have my head because of you. This was his way of saying, if I give you an exemption from eating his food and you're not as healthy as the rest of the guys, he's going to take my head for it. And so Daniel does something brilliant at 15 years old. He says, let's just run a test. How about 10 days? We eat our vegetables and water. You feed them whatever the king wants them to eat. At the end of 10 days, you look and let's see who looks healthier. If we're healthy, if we're doing well, let us keep eating it for the rest of the 3 years. If we're not, okay. And this is what, talk about integrity. This is where Daniel showed it. He said, but we're not going to blame you, Ashpenaz. We're not going to blame you because we didn't eat the food. If we don't look as healthy, we will take the penalty. We will suffer the consequences. We're not going to push the responsibility onto you to answer for it. And so they do. Test for 10 days. You may know the story. At the end of 10 days, they do look healthier. For 3 years, they get to eat whatever they want. At the end of 3 years, when they're done with this training program, the final exam, some of you college students are doing that this week, final exam, imagine this. You go in front of King Nebuchadnezzar and he grills you with questions and you have to answer them. And he decides, keep or discard, keep or discard. And so Daniel and his friends show up in front of Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar finds them 10 times wiser than all the other young men. He gives them prominent positions in the government, and we all think, well, there's your happily ever after story. You do what God says to do, and he's going to bless you. No, that's not the story. I'm going to pause the story right here, but things get worse for Daniel and his friends. They do not get better. Matter of fact, they get more challenging, and they have more tests the rest of their life than this one. This is the easiest one they have. And we're going to talk more about that next week. But I wanted to pause at this part of the story because there's a question that I think is worth all of us asking ourselves. And the question is simply, have you made up your mind ahead of time? Now, the reason I wanted to ask that question is because most people don't. Most people make up their mind one day, one moment, one decision, one emotion, one financial opportunity, one career circumstance. Most people just make up their mind in the moment what they're going to do. And you know this. I don't have to tell you this. If you're caught in the tension between what integrity would do and what your appetites and desires say to do, and you wait until you're in the moment, you're going to choose your appetites about 90% of the time because they're the louder voice in the moment. The people who have the ability to make the choice consistently to choose integrity, which then allows them to become the kind of people that we all respect and admire, I'm telling you, they are people who make up their mind ahead of time. They make up their mind ahead of time. I'm just going to tell the truth in those situations. It may be uncomfortable. I may not want to. But when they call and ask what I'm doing, if I'm not doing what I want them to think I'm doing, I'm just going to tell them the truth about what I'm doing. I'm just going to do this with that financial situation. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if it's going to benefit me or not. I'm always going to handle it that way. I'm always going to be transparent. I'm never going to do anything that I would not want to have to explain to somebody if they ask me about it. People with integrity always make up their mind ahead of time that integrity is going to win. And they don't do it because they're better people or they got stronger character. They do it because they know how weak their character will be in the moment, and they've got to decide in advance what they're going to do and not do. They've got to decide while the emotion is low when the emotion is not high. So, have you ever done that? Have you ever just mentally said, I'm making up my mind. Here's how I handle situations like that before I'm ever in them. My suggestion, my advice to you would be make up your mind to do what you ought to, even when, especially when, it costs you. Now listen, for those of us who follow Jesus, this is exactly what Jesus did for us. Days before he's going to arrive at Jerusalem, be arrested and crucified, he knows everything that awaits him. Matter of fact, everybody's telling him, do not go to Jerusalem. And you know what one of the writers of his life's account said? It says, Jesus set his face for Jerusalem, which was just his way of saying, Jesus said, I'm going to make up my mind right now that I'm going through with this before I ever get there. Because once I get there, it's going to be hard. Once I get there, the temptation is going to be great. And aren't you glad he did? Aren't you glad Jesus didn't wait until all the pain and the suffering hit to go, well, do I actually want to go through with this for them or not? Do I really love them that much or not? Aren't you glad he decided ahead of time? We're all glad he did. Because we wouldn't have grace, mercy, peace, and forgiveness if he hadn't have. So will you make up your mind ahead of time? I'm telling you, if you will, there are going to be some people who are really glad you do. The people you love the most, people you care about, people who are closest to you, people you work with, go to school with, people who are your friends or inner circle. They're going to be so glad you did because integrity is personal, but it's not private. And your lack of integrity will impact them, and your integrity will benefit them. So make up your mind ahead of time. Do not sacrifice integrity and close the door to God's activity because you think you got to control the outcome. Just decide in advance. I'm going to do what I ought to, even if it costs me. And you'll be glad you did. But the people that you care about most, they'll be thrilled you did because your irresponsibility will not become their responsibility. Let me pray for us. Father, would you help us to do that, to have enough courage, even though we know it may cost us, even though we wish we could keep our options open, have some wiggle room. Would you help us just to decide in advance that we're always going to do what we ought to, the right and the noble thing, no matter what it costs us. Help us to have the courage to follow through with that. For those who are facing situations right now, this week, they're going to be in a situation and they could decide right now what they're going to do, but they kind of like to keep their options open. Help them to decide anyway and to close any door that doesn't take them straight to integrity. Jesus, thank you so much for doing that for us, for setting your mind to go in to die on our behalf so that things could be good between us and you. We're all so glad you did. Help us to live our lives in such a way now that maybe one day, because of the choices we've made and the integrity we've shown, that we'll be on somebody's list, that they'll be glad we did, that we'll be the kind of people they want to be like, that they respect and admire because of the integrity we've shown. That's in your name we pray. Amen. Hey, if you'd like more content like this, subscribe to our YouTube channel and download our Journey app to access all of our recent message content. And our app is the easiest way to share this content with a friend. For more information on our church or to find our app or our YouTube channel, just visit JourneyCalway.com. That's JourneyCalway.com. Thanks for listening.